Well, hey, welcome to 316, a Bible study of Bridgeway Church, where we are excited to be connecting with you for this study as we're in the prophets, the Old Testament prophets, and we're focusing primarily on the major prophets. Now, I'll tell you, in the fall of 23, we're going to be doing a step-by-step through the minor prophets, and I hope you'll join us for that. So far, we've covered Samuel, we've covered Elijah and Elisha, we've covered Isaiah, and tonight the topic is Jeremiah. Now, I want us to go ahead and jump straight in because we have a lot of ground to cover. And while we're flipping over to this look, something about Jeremiah for a little trivia is if you think about what book in the Bible has the most words, what book in the Bible has the most words? Well, you're probably already kind of figuring out that it's Jeremiah, and that would be correct. Some people would go to the book of Psalms because it has 150 chapters, but that actually is number 3 on the list. There are about a little north of 30,000 words in the book of Psalms. Genesis is actually number 2 with just over 32,000 words. And the book of Jeremiah has just over 33,000 words. Coming in fourth would be Isaiah. And even though Isaiah has more chapters than Jeremiah, there are slightly less words. Isaiah is just under 30,000 words. So just a little bit of trivia for yourself. Now, as I said here, we're going through Jeremiah, looking at him as a person and the writing. And one of the things that we've established so far in this study is that anytime we're looking at a prophet, you really do well to look at the kings, because the kings are the reasons most commonly why the prophet is raised up by the Lord to speak. And we have talked about Samuel, who is the first prophet as far as Old Testament, that's not counting Moses. Paul in the book of Acts would call Samuel the first prophet, and Samuel served as kind of this midpoint. He served as priest following Eli. He served as the last of the judges. You have the book of Judges and then into Samuel. So he served as the last judge, but he also served as the first prophet, and he established the company of prophets. Well, if you're going to look at him, though, you study also King Saul and King David and the context going on with them in the midst of Samuel. For Elijah, we talked about King Ahab. He was the prominent king of Elijah's ministry and the reason why God raised up Elijah. And then you saw the son of Ahab. And the real combatant to the Israelites at that time were the Arameans coming out of Syria. For Samuel in his time, it would have been the Philistines in the battles with David. Goliath was a Philistine. But if we keep coming down, Elisha, the kings that he dealt with was Jehoram, who was also a son of Ahab. And then you get into Jehu, who was the one who kills Jehoram, and then you Jehoaz and Joash, and still the Arameans were the problem. And we did kind of a deep dive on Elijah and Elisha. Now, our last study, we talked about Isaiah, and the kings of Isaiah were Uzziah. We read about in chapter 6, in the year that King Uzziah died, Isaiah says, I saw the Lord high and lifted up in the temple, and his train filled the temple. And the one that followed Uzziah was Jotham. Jotham was his son. And then you had King Ahaz and then Hezekiah, all one kind of long family line of kings. And Isaiah has to prophesy significantly regarding Ahaz. And if you missed that, we'd love to have you listen back. The real combatant to Israel was the Assyrians, and Isaiah, as you'll remember, was prophesying to the northern section, northern territory, which was the 10 tribes of Israel. Well, if we continue in this track, then we get to Jeremiah, and Jeremiah is prophesying to the southern section, and that would have been Judah. And you'll see here the kings that he is prophesying to, or amidst Josiah and Jehoaz, Jehoiakim, Jehoiachin, and Zedekiah. Now, just a little bit, I'm going to give you what might be a few minutes kind of recap of these kings just so you know the context, because Jeremiah is prophesying that judgment is coming. He is often considered the 11th hour prophet because he is prophesying as judgment against Judah. The southern section it's there. It's coming. King Josiah was a good king. He was a godly king. He comes into power as a young guy, very, very, very young guy. He is the one noted with the story that a copy of the Torah is found in the temple. I mean, you imagine a copy of the Torah being lost in the temple, and they find it. It's kind of literally has to be dusted off. They read it. He repents for the abomination of his people. He calls for reformation, for idolatry to cease, for pagan worship to stop. And this is all throughout Judah, and somewhat of a revival happens under Josiah. It's not real deep. It's not real heartfelt from everybody, because once Josiah dies, then the people of God in Judah return to that pagan worship, and they do so under Jehoaz, who was the son of Josiah. So these two kings that you see, Jehoaz and Jehoiakim, both of them were sons of Josiah. Interestingly enough, a little bit of trivia for you, Jehoaz was the younger of those brothers, and Jehoiakim actually wasn't named Jehoiakim, it was Eliakim. And Jehoaz is leading for a bit, but he is not a godly leader whatsoever. Reinstitutes pagan worship, idolatry. And idolatry is one of the big problems for Judah and why judgment comes. And we'll see some of that. Jehoiakim, or Eliakim, Eliakim, that's a better way of saying Eliakim, actually has support from Egypt down south. And Necho, who was the ruler of Egypt at the time, helps overthrow Jehoaz and install Eliakim, and has his name changed to Jehoiakim. So I'll try and show you some of this on a map in just a bit. Jehoiakim is the one that's in charge of Judah when Babylon finally comes in for the first time and does a first measure of destruction and makes Judah what is called a vassal city. Now, I've talked with Bridgeway frequently about a vassal city. A vassal city, a number of people are allowed to stay within that town, but they cannot rebuild a wall, they cannot build an army, and they have to pay taxes. And so this was a common practice of defeating an area in the ancient context to make them a vassal city. People still live there. However, they're under new authority, so to say. But following Jehoiakim, and you'll see some stuff about him, he ends up being killed, and then his son Jehoiachin is going to be installed at a very young age. He's 18 years old, and he's only going to be there for three months before he is deported to Babylon. And then the final king, which will be at the ultimate destruction of Judah, is Zedekiah. So that's why you see Babylonians. 605 BC is going to be that first wave of destruction. 586 is going to be that final wave of destruction. 605 is going to be linked to Jehoiakim, and then that 586 is going to be linked to Zedekiah. And we'll connect all this to Jeremiah, because it's amidst those guys that Jeremiah is prophesying, and he is going to be utterly rejected by the kings, by the priests, by all the people of Judah. And we can read about this also in 2 Kings chapter 22 through 24 and 2 Chronicles 34 through 36. Now, last thing that I'll say, and then I'm going to move on from this image, is often you'll have a prophet that's defined as pre-exile. He's prophesying before destruction, or he's an exile prophet, and he was prophesying amidst the deportation, so to say, an exile, or he's post-exile. So a number of the minor prophets that we're going to touch in the fall are post-exile, as people are returning to Jerusalem or to the Holy Land. There are prophecies that are given, and they often are post-exile. Jeremiah is both pre-exile and exile. He is prophesying before it happens, and he prophesies in the midst of it. And so you're going to see this, that he prophesies literally as Jerusalem is being destroyed, and that's where you get the book of Lamentations. And so with that, we're going to look tonight just at three things: his calling, kind of how God calls him. Then we'll look at some of the content and some of the context of the book of Jeremiah. And then we'll finish with one look at the covenant that God establishes in the writing of Jeremiah. So with that, let's look at the first part, his calling. And it says in chapter 1, the words of Jeremiah, son of Hilkiah, one of the priests of Anathoth in the territory of Benjamin. Now let me just pause there. This Anathoth is a town about 3 miles outside of Jerusalem. It was a Levitical town, meaning for priests. It was a town that priests were. It was a town that priests would raise their family. So Jeremiah is the son of a priest. He grows up as a preacher's kid, so to say. And it says the word of the Lord came to him in the 13th year of the reign. And now it's just going to capture some of those kings. It's not going to identify all 5. It'll identify 3, but it'll bookend. The first one is in the reign of Josiah, son of Ammon, king of Judah, and through the reign of Jehoiakim. Remember, Jehoiakim was the son of Josiah, but there was also another brother in there, Jehoaz, and he ends up in Egypt, and it doesn't go well for him. Son of Josiah, king of Judah, down to the 5th month of the 11th year of Zedekiah, and that's just pointing to Zedekiah. He is the last king of Judah, son of Josiah, king of Judah, when the people of Jerusalem went into exile. So that's going to be 586 BC, famous exile, famous destruction of the town of Jerusalem. Now, continue in verse 4. It says, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. Now, before I move off of that, to me, that's incredibly important to all of the book of Jeremiah. It's easy to overlook it, but I think that is incredibly important because I'm telling you ahead of time, if you don't already know this, Jeremiah is going to be rejected for the entire time of his ministry. He is going to have on the short side 40 years, on the high side 50 years of ministry. There's ambiguity about the exactness of that. He is going to have more than 4 decades of ministry. He's going to be rejected by the kings. He's going to be rejected by the other priests and prophets. He's going to be rejected by the people. Not by a couple, but completely. If he lived in this day, he would be the face of what it means to be canceled. And so God is establishing very early on for him, number 1, I'm the one that called you. Not your dad, not the fact that you're a preacher's kid, not the fact that you grew up in a preacher's town. I called you. And when did I call you? Before you were even formed. Not so that you think I saw talent in you or I recruited you. He says, I called you and set you apart before you ever were formed. That's going to be important for Jeremiah because he's going to want to quit a lot. He's going to have a lot of quitting opportunities, and he's going to be reminded he belongs to the Lord and the Lord's assignment. So continuing here in verse 6, it says, Ah, sovereign Lord. The Hebrew word there for ah is basically no. He's basically saying no. I mean, and this isn't a defiant no, this is no. So he is not wanting to do it, and he gives the reason why. I do not know how to speak. I'm only a child. But the Lord said to me, do not say I'm only a child. You must go to everyone I send you to and say whatever I command you. And he's going to have some really hard things to say. He's going to have some really hard illustrations to make. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you and will rescue you, declares the Lord. Now, I know what it is to be a young minister. I gave my life to the Lord when I was 16, felt like I was called into ministry around 18, that became clear to me. And a verse like these, verse 4 to this, would be something that I would embrace. God's called me, this is exciting. Don't be afraid. He's with me. He's going to rescue. I'm now 50, headed into 51 in the coming week. And when you start to realize that kind of statement from the Lord means there are going to be some really hard days. There are going to be some really devastating things to your soul then God is telling him, I'm with you, and I want you to know I'm going to help you. This is going to be essential for Jeremiah as he ages, as he becomes older and older, and because he is not going to be married. We know that from the book of Jeremiah. God told him he could not be married, and so he does a lot of aloneness, and so he finds himself entirely in God. Now, finishing out the portion on his calling here, it says in verse 9, Then the Lord reached out his hand, touched my mouth, said to me, Now I've put my words in your mouth. That'll be interesting and important. I've put my words in your mouth. Keep the concept of words, God's words. Okay, so we'll come back to that. I've put my words in your mouth. See, today I appoint you over nations and kingdoms to uproot and tear down, to destroy and overthrow, to build and to plant. And that's another thing that's like, okay, nations, Judah, you're going to see was small at the time. I'm going to show that to you on a map. And to uproot, to tear down, and that nations are going to listen, to build, to plant, those are okay. It sounds bigger than what he was going to be able to do. It was most definitely bigger than the little town he was coming out of, the little priest town. And so this all kind of comes to his name, Jeremiah, which his name means Jehovah lifts up. One thing that you're going to see if you studied the book of Jeremiah is you'll find out he is very heartfelt. He's often defined as the weeping prophet, not just the 11th hour prophet, but the weeping prophet. And not just because of lamentations or to lament, he's weeping over Judah being destroyed, but he really does love the people, even though they reject him. He really does love God's people. He also loves God more than he loves the people. And he wants to see them turned, and he is broken by their resistance. And so often scholars will pull back and say in the New Testament, he is a foreshadowing of Jesus. Jesus weeps over Jerusalem. Jeremiah had wept over Jerusalem as well. Jesus is rejected by the priests and the religious leaders of Jerusalem. Jeremiah was rejected by the people in Jerusalem. And so we see a real close connection between Jeremiah and how he carries himself both in life and ministry. And we see a foreshadowing in him connected to the Lord. So he is a very powerful one to study. Now, I said we're going to go from calling into content and context. So let me give you a couple things on maps so we can just kind of see. So last time we were looking at Isaiah and dealing with the map of Isaiah, and the real primary opponent or combatant to northern Israel. Remember, they're split. Unified Israel becomes divided, and you have northern Israel, 10 tribes, southern Judah, 2 tribes, and Judah and Benjamin. And then you had the Assyrians. And they were more powerful than the Egyptians, but they covered more territory than what is yellow. But that's kind of the central city look, the controlling city area. So Israel would try and partner with the Arameans, even though they had hardship with them before, as you saw from Elijah and Elisha. That's where Damascus is. It's present-day Syria. And that's where Isaiah is prophesying. Isaiah is prophesying to Israel amidst that kind of landscape. Now, let's jump ahead then to Jeremiah's map. And now, instead of Assyria controlling, Babylon's controlling pretty much everything. So what was yellow by the Assyrians is now controlled by the Babylonians. That's why I've changed the color. And Babylon has come in and has toppled the Assyrians and has toppled Egypt. Even though they are still there, they are not the world power the Babylonians are. You can see on this one that now Israel's gone and Aram's gone. Isaiah had prophesied that both would be destroyed and eliminated. And that is exactly what happened. And so Jeremiah is prophesying to those 5 kings, Josiah, Jehoaz, Jehoiakim, Jehoiachin, Zedekiah, all within that small little area of Judah. Now think about this. Here's why the problem really got expedited for Judah. Israel did not want to believe the Lord. Northern Israel. They didn't want to believe Isaiah, didn't want to believe the Lord. They tried to create their own alliances. And when you create alliances, you often would bring in their gods. So think about Aram. Let me just go back to it, actually. If I went to Aram, just up towards where that A is a town called Sidon. The Sidonians, that's where Jezebel was. They worshiped Bel up in that Sidonian area. If you had alliances, then you also worshiped their idols. So the problem was idolatry, and God says, I won't have any of this. So come back to Jeremiah's. You have Judah, and God is saying, I'll be your God. I'll defend you. I'll help you. And the temptation of the kings, not Josiah, but the ones that followed, were to create alliances. You know, Eliakim, who had his name changed, he has an alliance with Egypt. That's how he ends up in power. And then they're trying to create different alliances and therefore worshiping other gods of these other areas. And it's just incredibly pagan, but still trying to have their own identity. And because of that, it becomes this platform for judgment where God says, you've pushed me out, you worship other gods, you do things that are detestable, you don't hold the law of Moses, my law, you don't hold the sacrifices properly, you don't hold the civil law on how you relate with one another properly. Law of Moses would be ceremonial law. Those would be the feasts and the sacrifice. You don't hold the civil law, how you engage one another. You don't hold the moral law. That would be the 10 Commandments. And so Jeremiah is raised up as a voice that judgment is coming in the context of this. Now, Jeremiah is going to be called by God to write these prophecies down, and the collection of all his prophecies for all that period is what you have in the way of the book of Jeremiah. And he's using a guy by the name of Baruch. I'm going to show this to you. One thing to keep in mind is the book of Jeremiah isn't so much linear in everything. There's a lot of poetry, there's a lot of movement in time period, and there's a lot of imagery. So we read in chapter 36, further down in the linear look, how God called him to assemble this book that you have, the book of Jeremiah. This word came to Jeremiah from the Lord. Take a scroll, write on it all the words I've spoken to you concerning Israel, Judah, and all the nations from the time I began speaking to you in the reign of Josiah, which was first king, till now. Perhaps when the people of Judah hear about every disaster I plan to inflict on them. It's coming, 11th hour. It says, each of them will turn from his wicked way, then I will forgive their wickedness and their sin. I want to heal them. I want to help them, but I need them to repent. So Jeremiah called Baruch, son of Neriah, and while Jeremiah dictated all the words the Lord had spoken to him, Baruch wrote them on the scroll. Now, Baruch has a very effective and a big contribution to the book of Jeremiah in the culmination of all the prophecies that Jeremiah gave over this more than 4-decade time period. And so he is partner with him, and once again, it's like it does not get laid out in just perfect linear fashion, A, then B, then C, then D. There is some movement in it. There is some poetry in it that is both prophetic and it's all forewarning. There is a lot of imagery, and so it helps us if we understand, that Baruch is assembling these prophecies, not just one right after the other. So Jeremiah is going to be used to use a lot of metaphors. Okay, so I've given just a few here, to not all of them. And these aren't the only places that are identified. So one of the common things that goes, and I put this at chapter 2 and chapter 3, but it continues through a big portion of Jeremiah's prophecies, is adultery equaling idolatry. I told you that the real problem was idolatry and the direction of pagan worship to worship other gods, rejecting the Lord. And all throughout Jeremiah's prophecies, he likens the the idol worship, the idolatry. He likens it to adultery. So you'll regularly read these visuals of adultery, and it's not so much man with a woman that's not his wife or that kind of context, but it is that you're worshiping other gods. So he uses the metaphor of adultery to show what idolatry really is like. He'll use in chapter 4 a visual of unplowed ground or fallowed ground. If you ever hear people say, break up the fallowed ground, it's a first reference to Jeremiah 4, where he's talking about more the hardness of hearts. He doesn't use that language, but that's what he's revealing, is that people's hearts are hard. You got to break up that ground. Temple of the Lord. One of the things that was regular for the priests in the area of Judah was to say, Temple of the Lord, Temple of the Lord, Temple of the Lord. It would be said like 3 times, Temple of the Lord, Temple of the Lord, Temple of the Lord. And it was the idea that God wouldn't dare bring judgment on us, because after all, we have the temple of the Lord. And Jeremiah says that means nothing. You have the symbol of the Lord, but you don't have the source of the Lord. You've rejected him. Very, very similar to how Jesus said, I'm going to tear this temple down. In 3 days, I'll rebuild it. And he's talking about his resurrection. And so when you see temple of the Lord, temple of the Lord, temple of the Lord, Jeremiah is pointing out the deception of priests and prophets telling people things that they were saying everything's going to be okay. And Jeremiah's like, no, it's not. Judgment's coming. He has one in chapter 13 where he's told by God to take a garment and to bury it in this area that was marshy, and then to put on after days, to put that on, dig up that garment and wear it, and it was very soiled, and it's likened to the sin of Judah, the sin of the people of God. And so God is trying to visualize to the people the nature and the degree of their sin. If you've ever heard the term backsliding, I remember hearing somebody one time say, backsliding, that's not really so much a concept for a Christian. It's not in the Bible. It's consistently in the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah talks about backsliding multiple times, and it's the concept of literally to slide back. It's to lose footing and to be going back, and it's likening, or it's being used in reflection of to reject God. Backsliding isn't, well, I started listening to music that I'd given up, or I drank something that I used to give up. The backsliding is a picture of what it is to reject God. I'm rejecting God and going my own way. And he'll use this visual numerous times. One last one, and there are more visuals than this, but he uses a potter's wheel. God tells him to go to this potter, watch him on the wheel, and then to take this clay pot and go out and smash it. And in chapter 18, he's likening, this is what Israel is. This is what my people are. This is what they've done with my covenant. This is what they've done with my blessings and what I've done to them. And this is what I'm going to do to them. And once again, it's warning, but God is telling him, if you'll repent, if you'll turn, I'll bless you. But listen, and I hope you get this in the study of the prophets. As the king went, the people went. And that is at its root, in my opinion, why God early on said, I don't want you to have a king. I don't want you to have a king, because you will take your markers not from Scripture and not from God. You'll take your markers from the king, and if the king errs, you'll err. And the prophets are raised up, because as the king went, so did the people. Now, Jeremiah suffered in his ministry. He was fruitless. And when I say fruitless, you can't mark where he had converts in the book of Jeremiah. He probably did have some, but it's just not identified. It's a real dark path for him. He's rejected by the last 4 kings. Remember, Josiah is the good king, and he is going to, we don't have record of him rejecting Jeremiah, but the primary time of Jeremiah was with the sons of Josiah. The people rejected him because the kings had set that precedent. The priests prophesied peace. So I'll show you just one verse, Jeremiah 14, verse 13. The prophets will keep telling the people, You will not see the sword or suffer famine. Indeed, I'll give you lasting peace in this place. That's what they were saying. Jeremiah is saying, this is what the priests are telling the people, and the people are buying it. That you're not going to see sword or suffer famine, and there's just peace coming. And Jeremiah was saying that's not true. God has made this very clear. Coming back to it, there's a plot that's put against Jeremiah's life, and it comes from his own hometown. Remember that town of priests, Anatoth? That's where the plot against his life originates from. And you can read it for yourself, but they plot to assassinate him. And man, you want to talk about getting frustrated. And then he's imprisoned multiple times. He's imprisoned multiple times. One time he's put down in a cistern. He's held. He's thinking, I don't know if I get out of here. I don't know if this is the end of me. And you jump a little ahead in his ministry, and that's where you have this real famous statement. But if I say, because he's wanting to quit. In chapter 20, he's wanting to quit. He's like, God, I'm done. I don't want this. But then he says, but if I say I'll not mention him or speak anymore in his name, his word is in my heart like a fire shut up in my bones. Now remember, when was his calling? I've put my words in your mouth. And Jeremiah is recognizing and stating, his words in my heart, and it's like a fire. I can't quit. And I think that comes back also when you come back to, one last look at this. When you look at no converts and you look at rejection from kings, people, priests, prophets, you plot against your life, you're being thrown down into a cistern. Sometimes you need those things to remember. It was God that called me. It was God that formed me. It's God that's put his words in my heart. Now, if we go lastly to the last portion of context and content, he has warnings and there's warfare. So the warning, he's warning everyone to repent from the king. So he starts with kings because as the king goes, the people go. He is warning that the Babylonians are God's instrument of judgment, to which priests and prophets in that area are like, no, we're not going to see any danger. And he's like, yeah, you are. Yeah, we all are. In warfare, 605 BC. Now follow me here. 605 BC. Babylonians come towards Judah, not just Jerusalem, but all of Judah. And in 605, they begin the first portion of destruction and exiling people. Okay? So that is going to begin a process of exile that's going to last more than right around 70 years. You can read this in chapter 24. Now, here's where this gets interesting, okay? So, if I leave that up for just a second, you have Jehoiakim. If you just kind of try and remember Josiah, then Jehoaz. Jehoaz is down in Egypt now. Jehoiakim, and he does evil before the Lord. He's a ruler for about 11 years. He ends up being overthrown, and then you have his son Jehoiachin, and it's in this first portion of 605. They're rejecting this vassal city that many people are going to be deported to Babylon. It is what is believed the time period that Daniel and who would be Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, remember those are Babylonian names that were given to them, that they were in that exile and that they were selected once they got to Babylon. Here's what's interesting. This is really easy to overlook in the book of Jeremiah. Following that exile, people leaving and being deported to Babylon, Jeremiah writes a letter. He writes a letter to the exiles, and it's right here in the book of Jeremiah, and I'm going to show you a portion of it. It's very famous. It says this in Jeremiah 29. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. You can read this. This is a letter. It says in verse 1 through 3, I'm writing you a letter. And he's telling them how to live in Babylon. To not live as prisoners, but to still live. He says, to all those carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon, build houses, and settle down, plant gardens, and eat what they produce. It says this is going to be 70 years. You'll see it in a second. Build houses, settle down, plant gardens, eat what they produce, marry and have sons and daughters, find wives for your sons, give your daughters in marriage, so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. Why? Because if you don't live this way, when it comes time for restoration, then you won't be there. Our people won't be there in existence to return. And so he says, do not decrease. Now jump into verse 10 in this letter. This is what the Lord says. When 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my gracious promise to bring you back to this place. And he does so. The Babylonians are defeated by the Persians, and then there becomes this exile back to Jerusalem. That's where you start to get Ezra, you start to get Nehemiah, you start to get this return and this remnant. But it's in that letter to the exiles that is one of the most famous verses of all Scripture. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope in a future. Then you will call upon me and come and pray to me, and I'll listen to you. So often people will quote this verse, Jeremiah 29, verse 11, and it's as though all life is good, and because he knows the plans he has for me, that plans to prosper and all this kind of stuff, I couldn't dare walk through troubled times. I'm going through losing a job, or I'm going through having an estrangement with my kid. And we're like, that's of the devil, because God knows the plans he has for me, plans to prosper me and give me a hope and a future. He does. But sometimes you get that word from the Lord in your path to exile. Sometimes you walk through things, if you've not been yielded to the Lord, or if he's accomplishing his purpose through a very unique path, he promises, I will see you through this. My encouragement to you and me, that kind of verse that was given to the people that were exiled and in travel to Babylon, is as true for you and me. That he knows the plans he has for our lives, plans to prosper and to bless us and give us hope and future and all that. But even if we walk through troubled times, we can have confidence in the Lord that he's with us. He has not abandoned us, even if we are going through hardship. He has not abandoned us. He's a good God. He's a faithful God. And we'll see that also through the covenant in just a second. Now, if I come back to warfare, following that in 586 BC is the final destruction of Jerusalem, and this is where Jerusalem is literally set on fire. Zedekiah falls to a horrible demise, and it is what Jeremiah had said was coming. We read this in Jeremiah 52. On the 10th day of the 5th month, in the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, Nebuzaradan, commander of the imperial guard who served the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. He set fire to the temple of the Lord, the royal palace, all the houses of Jerusalem, every important building he burned down. So Judah had been attacked in 605. Now Jerusalem is destroyed. Now, I want to show you a photo real quick. So I took this photo. This is a photo I took this year when we were in Israel. I am literally standing in what is called the City of David. It's the old City of David. It's the original old Jerusalem. If I were to pan the camera to the left, you can see present-day Jerusalem. You can see where, the western wall is just off to my left. In that direction. You can see Mount Olives, which is kind of straight ahead. You can see the Kidron Valley that you read about. Jesus had gone down through the Kidron Valley towards Gethsemane. If your screen is big enough to see, just under Gethsemane, where this gold, like kind of top of a chapel area, that's right down in Gethsemane. But I want you to look, if you look at the buildings just under the Mount of Olives, and I hope your screen is big enough to where you can look closely. One of the fascinating things is you can look at the different eras of stone construction, okay? So in Israel, they'll use the word tel, T-E-L, Tel Aviv, Tel Lachish, Tel Hazor. Tel is to just build on something. Tel Megiddo, that's where Armageddon will happen in the Valley of Jezreel. It's one layer that's built on another layer that's built on another layer. One of the common things in this area is to just build upon what was there. So this is an easy place at the city of David to see construction that's built on different stone levels from different eras. If you can zoom that in, you'll see one era of stones, and then you'll see another era of construction, and then you'll see another era of construction, and then you'll see where people are presently building and living today in houses. And one of the things in the lowest level of stonework around the city of David, remember this would have been Jerusalem. This is where Jeremiah would have been. One of the interesting things is archaeologists have found the remnants of the markings of burn, where there have been burn marks in stones. So you can tell on those bottom layers in different parts where there has been fire. And there's numerous places throughout the city of David where there's still the remnant and the identification that this place had fire all within it. So it's fascinating when you get to see it up close. But it's in the midst of that burning. Jeremiah was allowed to stay in Jerusalem and within Judah amidst the 605 destruction, and he was allowed to stay within Jerusalem amidst the burning of Jerusalem. He stayed in that area, and that's where you get the book of Lamentations. So the book of Lamentations has this voice of 5 voices: the voice of the city crying out, the voice of God crying out, the voice of the prophet crying out, the voice of the lost possessions and blessings crying out, and the voice of the people crying out. And that would be the book of Lamentations. Now, I want to come lastly to the covenant, because we said the third thing was covenant. In the middle of all this, God establishes through Jeremiah that a new covenant is coming. The time is coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. I'll put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I'll be their God and they'll be my people. So we read about the new covenant in Jeremiah 30 and 31, and this is ultimately pointing to Jesus. What is being depicted here? God wants to be the God of people, and I do not want you to have it on tablets of stone that get filed away in an ark in a town that you don't even come to, and that you worship only when you travel there on occasion where it's so easy to reject it. No, I'm going to put my law in your heart, and you can worship right where you are, and you can be with me and I'll be with you. And we find this ultimately pointing entirely to Jesus, that he is the one who is the author of the new covenant, that by his blood we're forgiven, by his blood we're included into the family of God, and it's through that relationship with Christ that we know that we are the people of God and that he is with us. So that is a look at the book of Jeremiah, the prophet Jeremiah. I hope you take the study, take it even further than we've had time, and I hope you'll join me for our next one, which will be a walk through Ezekiel. God bless you, and I'll see you soon.